5. Reconstructing the Self. Section 1. Reconstructing the Self. Given that modern science has fairly comprehensively deconstructed our folk psychological conception of the self, where do we start to try to provide some kind of positive explanation of the self? There are at least 4 places we can look to try and start this process. Firstly, cognitive approaches, and specifically here, theories of higher order thought. Secondly, theories which assume that the self is entirely a social construction. Thirdly, theories which posit a biological basis for the self. And fourthly, within this biological group, theories which argue that the emotions are the foundation of the self. During the rest of the course, we will be looking at all 4 of these areas. Cognitive accounts of the self tend to incorporate the following positions. 1. They resist biological explanations, such as John Searle's proposal that consciousness and the self are the natural products of the causal powers of nervous tissue. Second, the view that phenomenal consciousness is in some sense ineffable or indescribable because such states have fine-grained content that can slip through the mesh of any conceptual net. We can always distinguish many more shades of red than we have concepts for or could describe in language other than indexically, e.g., that shade. Thirdly, the view that perceptual states as well as beliefs can be unconscious. That, for example, there can be such a thing as an unconscious visual perceptual state. Below, we'll look at how higher order theories in particular apply these principles. Biological approaches to the self start with 2 very basic reductive propositions. First, that all organisms need to be able to recognize and defend a boundary between me and not me. This applies to single-celled organisms all the way up to human beings. And many theories have identified this as a basic conception of the biological self. Secondly, there are neural reductive theories of the self. Here, the self is seen as simply a byproduct of the complex neural circuitry built up by personal experience. Neural reductive theories of the self tend to be cognitive biological hybrids, such as Susan Greenfield's idea of the self as what she calls the personalized brain. This equates to what most people would call the mind, but Greenfield specifically excludes emotional experience from the foundations of the self. Her self is built entirely out of cognitive knowledge. Another version of neural reductionism is Francis Crick's dismissive assertion that you're nothing but a pack of neurons. But there are also more nuanced biological approaches to the self, such as those of Morris Edelman and Antonio Damasio, which we'll look at later in the course. These theories explain the human self as an intermixture of certain specific mammalian features of the human brain with higher human capacities, such as cognitive knowledge and language. In my view, the most sophisticated biological theories of the self are those that base it on a specific set of genetically determined human emotions. The most prominent and outspoken advocate of this position is Jaak Panksepp. We'll look at his theory in detail later in the course, but here we can briefly present his core claims. First, as an animal researcher, Panksepp asserts that all mammals, and possibly birds and other species, have direct phenomenal experience of emotional states. This contradicts the mainstream position in neurophysiology, which claims that this is unknowable, apart from the case of human beings who can verbally report their inner experiences. Secondly, the existence of conscious animal experience of emotion is important for Panksepp's theory when he considers human emotion. Again, contrary to mainstream neuroscience, he posits that human beings also experience emotions directly from the activation of primordial emotional centers in the brain's limbic system. This contradicts the conventional view that emotions only become conscious when the neurophysiological reactions of the limbic system have been analyzed by the higher cognitive centers of the brain. Thirdly, Panksepp claims to have identified 7 elaborate emotional systems in the human brain. He calls these evolutionary tools for living, and they guide the self in its confrontations with its environment.